Welcome, everyone. My name is Marie-Claude Gregoire, and I am the head of Directorate for Isotopes, Radiobiology and Environment at Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. On behalf of CNL, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, and our supporting partners, Atomic Energy of Canada, Health Canada, and the CNSC, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, thank you for joining us today. We are very excited today to have Paul Locke present as part of our low-dose radiation webinar series. The goal of our webinar series is to help strengthen connection within the research community by engaging world-leading researchers pertaining to the effects of low-dose radiation from different sources. If you joined us before, you'll know that we have an opportunity to ask Dr. Locke questions following his presentations. Please use the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can write there your questions for Dr. Locke. Okay, so a bit of a Dr. Locke bio. Dr. Locke is an environmental health scientist and attorney, and he is a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Locke's research, practice, and teaching focus on the intersection of law and science, seeking opportunities to replace animals in biomedical research with new non-animal in vitro methods. He leads an interdisciplinary team that advocates for the use of human-centric methods in toxicity testing and improvements in the drug development process. In addition, he is an international expert in radiation protection policy and radiation risk communication. He has written extensively and carried out numerous research projects concerning indoor radon. He is a member of the OECD NEA Nuclear Energy Agency's high-level group on low-dose radiation and co-chairs its communications subgroup. He also chairs the Advisory Council of the Columbia University Center for Radiological Research, which is committed to assisting the center in the advancement of basic research into the fundamental nature of radiation and its effects. Dr. Locke has published widely in both scientific journals and law reviews, including Health Physics, Frontier in Oncology, Scientific American and International Journal of Radiation Biology, as well as Environmental Law Reporter. Now I'm going to talk about what Dr. Locke will present today. His talk is entitled Reducing Lung Cancer Risks from Radiation Exposure, Radon-Resistant New Construction as a Significant Public Health Tool. This talk is based on research that Dr. Locke's PhD student carried out when he was completing his Master of Science degree, I think. Maybe I'm giving you, Paul, the microphone now and hand over to you for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me charge up my slides here. Try that again. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for being here today. Good day to everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. I'm delighted to speak. And as you know, my talk is going to focus on my work evaluating the lung cancer risk reduction potential of radon-resistant new construction in homes. Before I zero in on that topic, though, there are a few other areas that I want to cover. I want to start with a brief review of my education and professional career to date, because it really colors how I approach research. And then I want to talk about the radon research that I and my student advisees have undertaken over the past 6 years, which really is a program of using secondary data to examine public health interventions and problems. Now, after those topics are covered, I'm going to discuss in detail one of those projects, which is the evaluation of radon-resistant new construction, or I'll refer to it by its acronym, RRNC, as a lung cancer risk reduction tool. And I'm going to use Manheim Township, Pennsylvania, as an example. During this part of the presentation, I'm going to discuss research that my graduate student, Iquan Su, carried out, which was the topic of his master's thesis. Iquan is at this seminar, so I have to behave well and present his data well. And I'm fortunate that he's decided to stay at Hopkins to study for his PhD. After that part of my talk is over, I'm going to conclude by offering some lessons learned, both about working with secondary data, about how legal interventions are valuable for public health, especially looking at, of course, RRNC. And there's going to be time for discussion after the presentation. So I would ask that you hold your questions until then. You're certainly welcome to ask them orally at that time, but as you know, you can also pop them into the Q&A feature of the webinar. So to start out, I just want to talk about my background. I began my professional life as a Wall Street lawyer in New York City, working on complex financial transactions for large businesses, healthcare facilities, investment banks, and municipalities. My first office was actually in One World Trade Center. After several years on Wall Street, I transitioned to a practice in environmental law, again, mostly representing businesses. After a decade and a half of practicing environmental law, an opportunity arose for me to pursue a doctoral degree at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in Environmental Health Sciences, and I took advantage of that. And shortly after completing my doctoral degree, I joined the Hopkins School of Public Health faculty, where I now remain. Now, this professional arc has influenced my research and practice. As both an attorney and a scientist, I often study how legal interventions can benefit public health, and in fact, that's the question that a lot of my radon research has explored, as you will soon see. During the course of my career, I've also been involved in several radiation policy and science issues. These, of course, have included studies about radon, but I've also been involved in radiation risk communication, uranium mining, and several other ionizing and non-ionizing radiation areas. I recognize this is somewhat unusual, as most researchers tend to swim in one lane and stay in one area, but I feel very lucky, very fortunate that my career has allowed me to work across the radiation field. And that too has influenced my thinking about low-dose radiation and radiation protection. One of the areas I've been involved in is at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine committees, including one that I chaired on uranium mining in Virginia. This slide shows some selected reports from those committees, and these have been great opportunities to contribute to science policy, as well as meet scientists with different backgrounds but very similar interests. I also served as a member of the National Academy of Sciences Nuclear and Radiation Studies Board for a term of 6 years. And I can't leave this part of my talk without mentioning that I've had some great opportunities to work in Canada. Several of my projects have taken me there. During my work as chair of the Uranium Mining in Virginia Committee, I had the opportunity to visit Saskatoon and learn about uranium mining in Saskatchewan. I served as an expert witness on a uranium mining and risk communication case. I was employed by the Cree Nation of Mistissini, and I was also most recently on the President's keynote panel of the 2023 Canadian Nuclear Isotope Meeting. Well, that concludes my background discussion, and I hope it gives you an idea of how I approach problems and how I think about low-dose radiation protection and radiation protection in general. So let me now move on to talk about the radon research that I've carried out or supervised over the past 5 or 6 years. While my work on radon goes back several decades, for today's presentation, I want to concentrate on really the last half decade or so. These are projects that I've been able to take advantage of several large databases that are housed at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Johns Hopkins and the Commonwealth negotiated a data sharing agreement to gain access to these databases so we could utilize the data for public health and well-being studies. I'll have more to say about these databases later, but before moving on, I do want to acknowledge and thank the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Radon Office, which is led by Bob Lewis, for their support and their assistance over these years. Now, on this slide, I've highlighted some of the radon projects that have been led by my students over the past half decade. 3 of these projects, the project by William Bellamy, Sharon Edelson-Mamal, and Iquan Su, have examined radon-resistant new construction and lung cancer risk reduction. Another 3 projects, those led by Chris-Ann Cronin, Brianne Martin, and Joseph Tumfor, have studied radon, risk communication, and environmental justice. One project by Danae Johnson was an evaluation of U.S. federal radon laws. And finally, one project by Catherine Dixon was an independent assessment of a very unique radon removal technique to see if that technique was consistent with the radon standards in the United States. I'm really delighted to tell you that these students are just doing great. 2 of the students went on to law school. 2 are currently pursuing their PhD, one with me, and 1 is a professor at a liberal arts college. The remaining students are working at federal agencies. We've been fortunate to publish some of these studies in peer-reviewed journals and law reviews. And here is a list of where you can find them. The studies outlined in yellow, highlighted in yellow, are available in peer-reviewed journals. The red highlighted study is the one I'm going to talk about today. And we are in the process of preparing a journal submission for this work I'm going to talk about today, which hopefully, fingers crossed, will be out in the next year. Okay, let me now move on to talk about the radon research that what was supervised by me and largely carried out by Iquan Su. And in doing so, I'll begin by just telling you what I'd like to cover in this section of my presentation. I've got 5 main things I want to try to get through. First, I want to introduce the research by reviewing a few basic facts about radon and RRNC. Given this audience, I'm sure none of that information will be new to you. And in fact, I'm really going to short circuit that presentation for that reason. Next, I want to discuss the Pennsylvania radon bases from which the data is drawn. I'm then going to move on to talk about some of the analytical methods that we used, in particular, something called Tobit regression. And I also want to talk about how we applied a peer-reviewed radon risk reduction model to our analysis. Then I'm going to present some of our results and some of our conclusions. I'm not going to have enough time to go through all of the great work that we got to do for this study, but I'm happy to answer additional questions about it during the question and answer period. And also, I look forward to publishing the paper that this data will be based on so that you can see it in the peer-reviewed literature. Now, as I mentioned, I don't even have a slide on radon. I don't have a slide on my favorite part of this whole presentation, which is the uranium decay chain, which I'm sure you've memorized as I have. But I'm pretty sure that you're well acquainted with it. Just as a quick refresher, I'll remind you that radon-222 is a colorless, odorless gas that is a product of the uranium decay chain, the uranium-238 decay chain in this case. Remember that it is a noble gas too, so it's not chemically reactive. It has a half-life of about 4 days, and it gives off alpha particles when it decays. Radon can build up to high levels in homes and buildings because it can seep through the cracks in foundations. Removal of radon from homes and buildings is recommended in both the US and in Canada. And in the US, we have an action level of 4 picocuries per liter. which is about 140 becquerels per cubic meter. And the action level in Canada is about 200 becquerels per cubic meter, which is about 5.4 picocuries per liter. I just want to mention, by the way, that as I go forward, I will be referring to radon measurements in picocuries per liters. I really apologize. Here in the United States, we just have not adopted the metric system like the rest of the world, but all our data is in picocuries per liter. However, it's pretty easy to convert picocuries per liter to becquerels per cubic meter. For those of you that don't want to do that in your head, there are a lot of web-based resources that'll allow you to figure those things out quickly. Now, the major way to remove radon from homes is through subslab ventilation. And that's what's pictured here. This picture, by the way, is from the International Residential Radon Code. And I assume most of you are, again, familiar with this, but I'm not going to go through in any detail what it does or what it is. But we know that based largely on engineering studies, these subslab systems work well to remove radon. In the US, there are no federal national regulations about radon prevention. In the absence of federal regulations and federal actions, many states and local governments have been passing laws or adopting regulations that require RRNC. In Pennsylvania, local governments have been particularly active, and in fact, there are 13 jurisdictions in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that have enacted radon-resistant new construction ordinances that require RRNC to be installed in new building projects. Now, Manheim Township is one of the 13 Pennsylvania jurisdictions that has adopted RRNC, and it adopted RRNC ordinances about 20 years ago in June of 2004. Again, these require that all new dwellings that are built after this date install passive RRNC systems. And passive RRNC systems are subslab ventilation systems that work without fans. They can be turned into active systems very quickly and usually very easily by the installation of the fans, but the ordinance only requires that passive systems be installed. In Manheim County, there were actually 2 ordinances that were passed, but I'm not going to distinguish them here because they had basically the same purpose. So I'll just call them both the RRNC ordinances or the RRNC ordinance. If you look at this map, it's a map that EPA put together that charts out what are known as radon potential zones. Zone 1 is considered a county that has the highest potential for high radon levels. And as you can see by the flag here, the white flag, Manheim is in Lancaster County, which is a Zone 1 area. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania is a relatively populous area, and in fact, Manheim County is a relatively populated township. So that, from our perspective of wanting to study this, is a good thing because we've got several favorable conditions going on here. We have high radon potential, we've got a large population, and we have, as you will see, many tests. Okay, now the real fun begins. We're going to talk about the databases. So the first thing I want to say is that we have these 2 databases that we receive from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. The radon test database contains about 2 million radon tests that cover radon testing in the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania from 1988. I think our database ran through about 2017. The radon mitigation database contains about 190,000 tests at mitigation sites in Pennsylvania. And those were probed to look at which tests might be relevant to Manheim Township. So you see, out of that, after we did our initial cut, we got about 22,000 tests from the radon database and about 66,000 tests from the mitigation database. And this is not unusual, but the nice thing about this is we have some large numbers to work with, but we have to cut this down even further. We also managed to obtain from the Mannheim Township officials a housing database that contained 1,733 homes that were actually homes that we knew had radon-resistant new construction installed. They were homes that had this construction feature installed after the ordinances were passed. So our study explores radon risk lung cancer reduction potential in these homes. But what we did when we put this all together is we ended up with another data set now, when combining all this, of about 1,700 tests and 483 homes. We had to cut this down further, as I'll show you in the next slide. But before I get there, I also want to mention that we wanted to study the radon risk reduction potential in 3 populations: non-smokers, smokers, and ex-smokers. So we needed to get smoking data. And we also obtained that smoking data from a public database called the EDDI database, which is a database that is maintained by the Pennsylvania Department of Health. We used the smoking prevalence data from Lancaster County, and we assume that the rates and percentages of smokers, ex-smokers, and non-smokers in Lancaster County were the same as they were in Mannheim. So this is a little bit more detailed breakdown of how we process the data and how we got to our final data set. And I'm not going to go through all of the exclusions here, but I do want to just focus in on the bottom box, the RNC dataset box here. You can see we ended up with 570 records. And for each record is an address. I want to point out that this was de-identified data. We had data on addresses only. We didn't have the names of any people that live there. For those 285 addresses, at each address, we had pre and post mitigation data. And again, for the smoking prevalence, the figures we used were current smokers at about 11%, ex-smokers at about 24%, and non-smokers at around 66%. So going forward, this is where we started, given all of the data that we were given. Now, I want to dive in a bit to the data that we had. And just to start, I'll let you know that in my Introduction to Statistics course at Johns Hopkins, one of my professors who taught that course drilled into my head that you always have to plot the data. That was like his mantra. You always got to plot the data. So of course, maybe none of the statistics stuck with me, but that thought did. And the first thing we did, of course, was to plot the data and visually inspect it. And when we did that, we noticed a few things that I just want to walk through here. First, not surprisingly, the radon measurements are all heavily left skewed. Now, there are papers dating back into the mid-1980s that show that if you take radon measurements in a group of homes, they're going to look like this. So this wasn't a surprise, and in fact, it kind of confirmed that these measurements made sense. Left skewed distribution with a long tail is very, very typical. We also found, though, that there was a bump in the data at about 0.5 picocuries per liter. And that seemed a bit atypical, even though there are a lot of measurements in that low end, typically. But we sought to find out why that existed. So what we did was we had a consultation with the Pennsylvania DEP. And what we learned is that this data bump is actually an artifact that's due to the nature of the reporting and the online data collection system. When data is collected into the system, there's a convention so that all data that is 0.5 picocuries per liter or below comes in at 0.5 picocuries per liter. In other words, the lowest measurement in the database is 0.5 picocuries per liter. and the data is truncated at 0.5 picocuries per liter. After taking a closer look at that data, turns out, depending on the database, two large databases we had, it was between, I think, 10, 12 to 25, 30% of the data. We realized we needed to use a statistical correction method so that we could get a more accurate reading of the average radon measurements in the data. So we applied something called a Tobit regression model that's commonly used in these sorts of situations. And applying this model gave us a more realistic estimation of the radon levels across the distribution. So before the Tobit regression, our arithmetic mean was around 10.6 picocuries per liter. After, it was 8.88. Now, with this correction in place, we moved towards examining the reduction in radon that was associated with radon-resistant new construction. And after examining our database, we found, as I mentioned earlier, that it was common that at the same address, radon testers and mitigators had carried out at least 2 tests. This is a best practice that's used in the field to examine whether the RNC system is working or not. So one test was taken before the RNC system was activated, and then another test was taken after its activation. Sometimes there were multiple tests taken before and after. But using this information, we calculated the radon measurements before and after the RNC mitigation was engaged. And we found that on average, the radon level in homes before RNC was about 18 picocuries per liter, and that after mitigation, it was about 1.1 picocuries per liter, which you can see here. That means that the average radon reduction once you install an RNC was about 16.87 picocuries per liter in Mannheim Township. I want to now refer back to another study I had done with William Bellamy. And in this study, we had a much smaller sample size. We also had a lot less variability, or if you will, spread in the radon data. So the analytical methods we used here are not directly comparable to the analytical methods we used in the Mannheim study. But it is worth comparing, because what we had here were only 27 RNC homes, a much smaller sample size, and we found that before RNC, the median radon level was 3.3 picocuries per liter, but after RNC, the median level was 0.77 picocuries per liter. So there was still a substantial reduction, but it wasn't nearly as dramatic as it was in the Mannheim data. And again, I think one of the reasons for that is that in this sample, about 43% of the measurements that we had were above the radon action level. So there was no cause for mitigation. All right, turning back to the Mannheim study, we next estimated the lung cancer risk reduction associated with RNC. But in order to do that, we really needed to find a peer-reviewed radon risk model. And there are several great ones in the literature. I'm not going to go through our thought process and how we analyzed all of those. I'm just going to take you to the highlights and let you know that based on a number of factors, we chose to use a model that was developed by Dr. Sarah Darby and her team. And it was published in a joint analysis of 13 case control studies in Europe. That can be found in the British Medical Journal, and I think it was published in 2005. Now, as shown here, the Darby model consists of 3 dose-response relationships. The first model, the one, if you're looking at the screen that's all the way to the left, is a general population linear relationship. And it's a simple model that shows how increased radon exposure causes increased lung cancer risk. The second model is an estimation of relative lung cancer risk in subpopulations of smokers, ex-smokers, and non-smokers. And the third model evaluates the cumulative absolute risk of death from lung cancer in these 3 subpopulations. Now, because of limitations of time, I'm not going to talk about the second model here, the excess relative risk model. Again, please wait for the paper on that or ask questions about it in the question and answer. But I'm going to focus on what are here labeled as models 1 and model 3. So for model 1, this is the simple linear relation. We know that this model said that radon exposure, as it increases lung cancer risk, and that for every 2.7 picocuries per liter of increase in radon, the relative lung cancer risk increases 16%. That's what you see here. We also have a reference line here at relative risk equals 1 at no radon exposure. So since radon, this model is a dose response model, and it shows radon increase, we can simply reverse the curve to get an idea of what a decrease would mean. So obviously, if you can decrease radon 2.7 picocuries per liter, the lung cancer risk is going to decrease about 16%. So applying that first model, this is what we have here. We know that the average radon level before mitigation, before RRNC, was about 18 picocuries per liter. And we know after it was about 1.1 picocuries per liter. We can then create a reference line using the Darby information. And applying that Darby model, we can see that in the general population, RRNC reduces the relative lung cancer risk from about 2.06 to about 1.07. That means there's about a 99% reduction of radon attributable lung cancer risk in the general population. That's really great in terms of eliminating lung cancer risk, because it shows that RRNC has substantially reduced that risk. Let me now move on to the third model, the cumulative absolute risk model. And again, here I'm just going to look at two of the relationships that were generated by point estimates at the Darby model. These estimates specifically anticipate the deaths caused by lung cancer by age 75 in non-smokers and current smokers. And again, to remind you, we use the smoking data that we got from the publicly available Pennsylvania EDDI database that talked about smoking rates in Lancaster County. I should also mention, because I didn't earlier, that those rates are consistent in time with when we analyzed this data. In other words, from the 20-year period. That data we got was from that database, which you can see it is, again, publicly available. And if you need a reference for it, I'm happy to provide that at the end of our presentation. Now, you note that the slope of these two linear equations are quite different, and that's not a surprise, because smoking is obviously the major cause of lung cancer in the population. Radon is the second major cause of lung cancer and the major cause of lung cancer in non-smokers. But given the very, very strong relationship between smoking and lung cancer, we would expect to see something like this. So again, what we did with the Darby data and the Darby model parallels what I showed you earlier. And what you see here is that for lifelong non-smokers, the absolute risk was reduced by about 0.4%. Now, that's not a large reduction. It's a small number, but you have to remember that that's where most of the population is. Most people are non-smokers. So that even though that number is small, as you will see soon, you actually are getting a lot of bang for your buck there with RRNC. For current smokers, the absolute risk of smoking, of lung cancer is decreased by about 9% if you put in RRNC. Again, of course, if you eliminate smoking, that reduction is going to be much higher, but RRNC does have a substantial effect on reducing that risk. So going a little further, we wanted to try to estimate how many deaths might have been, lung cancer deaths might have been avoided by RRNC. So what we did was we went to the US Census Bureau and we found the population of Mannheim Township, which is about 40,000. And then we created a very simple formula looking at number of smokers and the risk reduction. And where we came out was RRNC ordinances are associated with avoiding about 400 lung cancer deaths among smokers and about 110 deaths among lifelong non-smokers. Now, I want to emphasize that this is preliminary data. The absolute risks used here are based on the cumulative risk at age 75, but we didn't have the sort of age-specific population data that we would have liked to have. So we take these numbers as a rough estimation, and we'd like to do further study to confirm them. Another thing that we looked at in this study was what is the rough cost effectiveness of different mitigation methods. So we went back to the mitigation database and we collected about 2,000 records in Mannheim Township to look at mitigation costs over the different methods. We calculated the average radon reduction and the average mitigation costs for each one of these methods. And then we computed an average cost across all the methods. That is the cost of reducing 1 picocurie per liter of radon. And what you can see here is that on average, if you spend about $137, you get a 1 picocurie per liter reduction in radon. Again, I want to note here that this should be considered preliminary data. The sample size is small, especially if you drill down into some of the mitigation subcategories. So we'd like to do additional research to confirm these results. Okay, so let me now make offer some conclusions about the radon-resistant new construction lung cancer risk reduction study that was done. And I think I'll start by just pointing out, obviously, what we showed is that RRNC reduced indoor radon levels by an average of 16.87 in Mannheim Township. Again, we were fortunate in Mannheim Township to have a large sample size, to have considerable variability in the radon levels. We have a long period over which the mitigation has been, the RNC has been in place, so we can look at a lot of mitigations, but this is a substantial number. The impact of these ordinances then has substantially reduced the radon attributable lung cancer risk in the population. In fact, it's substantially eliminated the risk in non-smokers, and it's reduced the lung cancer risk in smokers. And again, if you think back to what we looked at in terms of the entire population, there's a 99+% reduction in the lung cancer risk attributable to radon. Mitigation seems cost effective. Our preliminary results show that if you spend $137, you can get a 1 picocurie per liter reduction in radon. So overall, our conclusion is that radon-resistant new construction ordinances are impactful public health interventions. Now I want to talk about some of the policy implications and some of the important lessons we've learned. I'm going to now actually start by offering a couple of thoughts about secondary data. And using secondary data to study or analyze public health problems, I think, is always a good idea because first, there's a lot of excellent sources of secondary data out there. And second, they're either low cost or free. However, you have to be very, very mindful of what you're working with. Now, we were fortunate to have access to 3 great databases for this research. But as you saw, when working with them as secondary data, we had to really understand the source, how the data was collected, and that led to a sophisticated, we think, understanding on our part of their strengths and limitations. That's what I mean here when I say you have to understand the ecosystem in which the data was created. Now, I'm sure you've all seen studies using secondary data analysis that don't do this, that aren't careful with the data. And one way I like to think about this is that you can do 2 things to the data. You can either probe the data aggressively, cross-examine it until it tells you the truth, or you can torture the data excessively until it confesses what you want. When we do our studies, we always choose the first path, as I know you do too. But you always have to be on the lookout because sometimes researchers aren't as careful as they should be, and they fall into the second category, and the data does seem quite tortured and does confess what they seem to want. Now, another thing that has been very important about the collection of secondary data is to understand the legal piece of how the data got collected. And we were fortunate in Pennsylvania to have a very strong legal system that involves certification of testers and mitigators and mandatory testing. That, of course, led to us being able to analyze an absolutely wonderful secondary data set. As I mentioned earlier in my talk, one of the things that I like to do in my research is to assess laws, regulations, and policies and see whether they can be effective public health interventions. Now, given that exposure to high levels of radon is a health hazard, it's important to have radon interventions that work, and it's also important to show that they work. So given the research that we've been able to do, I think you could successfully show in a data-driven way that we have a very strong case to make for radon-resistant new construction. And I want to end my presentation here with just two thoughts that I have that my work on radon has taught me about low-dose radiation. Now, the first thing I wanted to say is that you can see from the radon action levels, both those adopted in Canada and in the United States, that there is an implicit acknowledgement that people will be exposed to some level of low-dose radiation because these are not set at zero. In the US, and I'm just going to talk about how the US policy has evolved because I don't have firsthand knowledge of how the Canadian policy has evolved, although I imagine it might be the same. But in the US, the EPA has taken the position that the 4 picocurie per liter level is a level that is not quote unquote totally safe, but rather it's a level set based on 3 things. The first is it is a low level that reduces risk substantially. Second, it's a level that mitigation systems can successfully reach. And third, it's a level that when we apply testing protocols, we are confident that those testing protocols can actually measure accurately in that level. So in this way, I think setting the radon policy in the United States is very, very consistent with radiation protection policies writ large, especially the concepts of ALARA and optimization. The next thing I want to talk about is that in my experience, health risks associated with radon are too often discounted or dismissed, especially by members of the public. As you know, radon is colorless, it's odorless, it's naturally occurring, and exposure to it can take a long time to damage your health. All of these factors combine to cause the public to really misperceive radon's risks. And in the US, I can tell you from personal experience that we've struggled for at least 4 decades about how to get people to test their homes for radon. I want you to keep this in mind because when you hear people say that the public is overly fearful of low-dose radiation, think about how people routinely dismiss radon and take that statement, that general statement, with a grain of thought. So the 2 lessons I have here are lesson 1, we have, I think, a robust radiation protection system, and it works well for low-dose and low-dose radiation situations. And lesson 2, let's not generalize about the public's fear of low-dose radiation. I think the public tends to think about radiation based on the source of the radiation and not the actual dose they're getting from the source. And that's why the public tends to dismiss radon risk and tends to be fearful of low-dose risks that come from other sources. So to wrap up, I have just a couple of acknowledgments that I'd like to make. Well, actually more than a couple. First, of course, again, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection Radon Division. I'd like to thank the Morgan James Scholarship at Johns Hopkins in my department for providing funding for some of our student work. In addition, I'd like to thank the US CRCPD, who also provided us with funding for our work. Ms. Jacqueline Nixon, who runs Citizens for Radioactive Radon Reduction, has been a leader in this field and has helped nurture the next generation of radiation professionals. I'd like to thank Iguan and for his great work. I want to make sure I acknowledge the students and faculty at Hopkins, and last but certainly not least, the Canadian National Nuclear Laboratories, your low-dose program, and Marie Cloud. So with that, I'm going to shut off my presentation, stop sharing, and open the webinar to questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Paul. It was a great presentation. I personally really enjoyed it, and it brings a very different perspective, indeed, to the low dose and the perception from the public with data, which is always great. So I'm going to read some of the, there's one first comment that was to note that Health Canada's radon guideline is a guideline and not an action level. So that also has some consequences that pertain to the Canadian ecosystem. So another question from Dustin was saying one of the common criticisms of new builds and passive systems is that they are not installed by contractors who know what they're doing. So how did Pennsylvania address that effective installation of these systems? Do you know?
Yeah, actually, can I comment on both of those? Because they're both really great comments.
Sure.
So first, I'm sorry I didn't make this crystal clear. In the United States, we have an action level, which is not a requirement. It's not a regulatory requirement. And in fact, we are parallel with Canada in that it is something that is voluntary. The federal government, our US federal government, does not have a regulation requiring any building or any home to reach it, and no state does either. So we are completely consistent in that way with Canada. In terms of the installation, I'll just speak to what I know and start out by pointing out that Pennsylvania has a very, very strong legal, if you will, web of radon laws. So for example, Pennsylvania requires certification and licensure of radon professionals like testers and mitigators. So you have to go through training, you have to register with the state if you're going to be putting in radon systems. And if you're going to be testing those. So I think that gives the public assurance. And it's a really good question and comment because we don't want to be creating a problem, whether it's high levels of radon or any other public health problem, if we don't have a group of service professionals who can actually deal with it in a competent way. So going further, putting on my legal hat, if you are really going to go for the whole shebang and have a very comprehensive radon system, you should have a set of radon laws and regulations that focus in on those service professionals. The other thing that does is it allows states like Pennsylvania to watch those service professionals. And for example, if they are not providing services that are up to snuff, then the state can take action and enforce against them. So I'll stop there and see if that answers the question. If not, I can continue and offer some more thoughts.
Thank you, Paul. There was also a question about how many of the radon tests are long-term, meaning more than 90 days. What is the average testing length? Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I can't dredge up from my memory whether all the tests were short-term, all the tests were long-term, or whether there was a combination of them. My recollection is that most of the tests were probably short-term tests. However, that being said, there is very good evidence in a series of papers that shows that those short-term tests are reflective of what long-term measurements would be. So I think we can be confident stating that radon systems work based on the short-term tests because of that background work.
Okay. Okay. Maybe you can share those papers, like later on with us. We'll redistribute that. Another question about your distribution data, which is that we have found radon levels to be log normally distributed. So why don't you use the geometric means instead of the topic model?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In the other study we did, the Bellamy study, we did use the log transform the data. The reason we didn't do it here is because, frankly, we just didn't need to. And we discussed this with the statistician, and I won't go into a long, analysis of that, but we were absolutely mindful of the fact that traditionally, if you take the left skewed log normally distributed radon data and you log transform it, you get a normal distribution. Now, clearly, if you're going to do complicated statistics and those statistical methods depend on a normal distribution, you'd need to normalize the data. But the techniques that I showed, we didn't do that. They were very simple they weren't simple, but they were more arithmetic. So the analysis that I showed did not depend on necessarily making a normal assumption.
Okay. 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 Thank you. Now there's a question about accrued DNA damage and the inversion of the lung cancer risk. And they're saying, okay, the accrued DNA damage does not go away after removal of radon as exposure. Is that a confounding effect? And they say this is supported by some literature, which suggests that lung cancer risk is consistent after cumulative radon exposure. So you've got like a long lead time after the implementation of these new construction standards. But is that going to be enough? And further to that question, do you intend to collect data for the next decade, for example, to just mitigate that sort of confounding effect?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, and that, I think, to me at least, if I'm understanding the question correctly, brings up some really important things that we in the radiation protection field need to deal with. One of the most important things is how do we use molecular information, because you started the question by asking about DNA damage. Yeah. With radon testing measurements, environmental measurements, and EPI. I think we have a lot of work to do on that. I think if it's going to be done anywhere in public health, it's going to be done in the radiation field. I wish I could tell you I've done that work. I haven't. I think there have been some good starts in that regard. Our US NCRP wrote a report about how you might combine, for example, epidemiologic and molecular radiobiology information. But I really don't have a good answer to that question other than to say it's something that we should do and need to do. In terms of the second part of the question about will we continue to study this? I think the answer is I would love to, but I'm very dependent on having good students and having a continuing relationship with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. I'm thankful to say that the PA DEP has been a great partner. And for those of you out there that are looking for students, are looking for projects, call me.
Okay,
I'd
cool.
love to work with you.
Yes, great call. I think also, like the comment was about maybe we can, you could think about, or you could tell the narrative about risk not further increasing rather than decreasing just because of that preliminary cumulative, exposure. That might be something to think about. Yep.
I just want to make sure, and I think I just want to paraphrase that. So, in other words, the comment really is we shouldn't just reverse the dose response curve because of the residual damage. I get that now. Thank you.
Yeah. So there's another comment about the data and the databases. And the question is, does AI data analysis cause you concern? And is there a risk that AI data analysis could weaken our interpretation of the data? It's a very broad question, I think.
Yeah. So if I understand the question correctly, it's and by the way, we did not use AI for this analysis.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah, we did it the old-fashioned way. Now it's hard to believe that I'm calling what we did old-fashioned, but the question about AI and data analysis is a good question that we need to generalize. And I've been trying to think about that generally about how you would use AI techniques to get data that you can rely on to make public health decisions. And I think right now, the way I see AI is we have very sophisticated methodologies and perhaps not the sort of mechanistic understanding we need to apply them properly. So I think, when I read an AI paper, one thing I try to really focus in on is there a good description of what the method of what the underlying biological process is and how AI is brought to bear on that process?
Yeah, great answer. Thank you. I've got a comment, and I'm going to read it. I'm not sure I understand everything, so and otherwise, if we just don't, if we need more information, maybe the author can provide more. So the comment is: I run the radon mitigation program for the PHAI, and the 2024 Ontario Building Code revision includes soil vapor and radon gas specifications for new build. It is very exciting that we have made this a requirement for new builds. So I understand that comment that the we have made a requirement is coming from the Ontario Association Public Health. So I think that's a good comment. But Tim, if I misrepresented your comment, you might add to it if you'd like. Another question is, does USA have studies of the economic impact of reduced death as a consequence of radon mitigation measures?
As to the first comment, I'm clapping. Thank you, Ontario, for it sounds like you've passed an RNC ordinance of some sort. I would love to learn more about it. Whoever wrote that comment, if you wouldn't mind emailing me or sending me a message through LinkedIn or whatever, I would really appreciate understanding a little more about how that developed and what you expect. The second comment, I'm sorry, I've forgotten it. I was so excited about this one. So
that's no problem. Does USA have studies of the economic impact of reduced illness and death as a consequence?
So if I understand the question correctly, and I may not, have we done studies of, okay, you've reduced radon, therefore you've reduced lung cancer risk, therefore there's been this positive economic impact. Okay. I am not aware of those studies, but I have to say I haven't looked in the literature for a number of years. I can tell you that one of my students, Sharon Edelson-Mammal, did start that evaluation. She looked at radon RNC and radon lung cancer risk reduction in Amityville in Pennsylvania. And she tried to assess in terms of costs what the reduction in costs has been. We haven't published that data yet, and I don't have it at the tip of my tongue. But I don't know of any studies that would be a great study to do. And as I said, those studies may be out there, and I just haven't seen them because I have not probed the literature recently with regard to those sorts of issues.
Okay, thank you. We also have a comment about really interesting residential radon data. Are you also focusing on radon levels in the workplace?
I have not focused on radon levels in the workplace, no, although that is an area of I think it is a really important area and an area of great interest. In terms of the laws, at least in the United States, and I believe also in Canada, it would be covered by a different series of laws, worker protection laws, as opposed to environmental laws. There are some radiation related regulations in the US. There might be in Canada too, but I don't know of anybody who's keeping that data. It may exist, it may be out there.
Okay. I think that we reached the end of the questions and comments. Anybody else would like to post anything? Okay, I think it's a great discussion. And I don't know, like if there's no further discussions or comments, I think it's really grateful that you are also calling for people to reach out to you if they would like to explore things and if they have students and want to collaborate. I think it's a great call. Like we consider our webinar successful when we enable and facilitate those connections. So that's really great. And yes, so thank you so much for participating, all of you, and thank you for your time, Paul. I know that like it takes a little bit of time to set up those presentations for the webinars. And with that, I think I will close the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody today.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Julie. Oh, you're on too.